Daniel Carter had spent most of his life surrounded by things people dreamed of having, yet he often felt like he was missing the one thing money could never guarantee. At 38, he was the owner of a global business empire worth more than $3 billion. He lived in a luxurious mansion, traveled in private jets, drove cars that cost more than most houses, and could buy almost anything he wanted with a single phone call. But behind the wealth and success was a man who had become deeply tired of wondering whether people genuinely cared about him or simply wanted access to his fortune. Every time someone discovered his identity, their behavior seemed to change. People who barely noticed him before suddenly wanted to become his friend. Business partners treated him differently. Strangers asked for favors, and women who appeared interested in his personality often became fascinated by his lifestyle once they learned how much he was worth. Daniel began to feel that nobody was looking at the real person behind the expensive suits and powerful name. One evening, after a dinner with a woman who spent nearly the entire night asking about his houses, cars, vacations, and investments, Daniel returned home feeling more alone than ever. He sat quietly in his enormous living room and remembered something his late mother had told him years earlier. She had always believed that genuine love could never be purchased, and that the right person would care about character rather than possessions. Her words suddenly felt more important than ever. Daniel began wondering how he could possibly know whether someone truly cared about him when his wealth was always standing between him and everyone he met. After several days of thinking, he created a strange plan. He would temporarily disappear from his billionaire life and become someone nobody would recognize. He rented a small, inexpensive apartment under a false name, bought worn clothes from a second-hand store, stopped using his luxury car, and arranged for his security team to stay far enough away that nobody would notice them. He wanted to experience ordinary life without his wealth protecting him. Eventually, he chose a busy subway entrance, where he could sit quietly among people who had no idea who he really was. Wearing old shoes, a faded jacket, and carrying a torn cardboard sign, Daniel sat on the pavement with an empty paper cup beside him, preparing to discover how the world would treat a man who appeared to have nothing. The next morning, Daniel returned to the same subway entrance, still dressed in the worn clothes he had bought for his experiment, and once again sat quietly beside the wall with his cardboard sign in front of him. He had expected people to react differently after seeing him there for several days, but most commuters barely noticed him. Some hurried past while staring at their phones. Others avoided eye contact, and a few dropped coins into his paper cup without saying a word. Daniel had never realized how invisible a person could become simply because society assumed they had nothing to offer. Then, around noon, a young woman named Emma walked toward the station carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder. She looked tired, as though she had already had a long day. But when she noticed Daniel sitting there, she slowed down. She glanced at his cardboard sign and then looked directly into his eyes. Instead of reaching for her wallet, she opened her bag and pulled out a neatly wrapped sandwich. She placed it beside him and said, "You should eat something." Daniel looked at the sandwich, surprised by the simple kindness. He thanked her, but Emma only smiled and told him to take care of himself before continuing toward the station. Daniel watched her disappear into the crowd, wondering why her small gesture affected him so deeply. She had not asked his name, his story, or what he could give her in return. She had simply seen someone who appeared hungry and decided to help. The following morning, Emma came back. This time, she carried a cup of hot coffee in her hand. When she saw Daniel, she smiled and said, "I remembered you from yesterday. I thought you might be cold." Daniel accepted the coffee, still struggling to understand why this stranger cared enough to remember him. She sat beside him for a few minutes and began talking casually, as though they had known each other for much longer. Daniel introduced himself as David, the false name he had chosen for his experiment. Emma did not question him or show suspicion. She simply treated him like an ordinary person. Over the next several days, she continued checking on him whenever she passed through the station. Sometimes she brought food, sometimes coffee, and sometimes she simply stopped to ask how he was doing. Daniel slowly discovered that Emma was not wealthy herself. She worked at a small community library and was saving money for a dream she had carried for years: opening a reading center where children from struggling families could have free access to books and a safe place to learn. And despite having very little, she continued, giving whatever she could to people she believed needed it more than she did. As the days passed, Daniel found himself looking forward to seeing Emma more than he expected. And what had started as a simple experiment slowly became something he could no longer control. Emma never treated him like a project or acted as though she was helping someone beneath her. She spoke to him naturally, laughed at his jokes, and listened when he talked about his life as David. Daniel continued hiding his real identity, but around Emma, he felt less need to pretend in other ways. He began telling her small truths about himself, carefully leaving out the part about his fortune. He admitted that he often felt lonely, that he had trouble trusting people, and that he sometimes wondered whether anyone could truly understand him. Emma never judged him for those feelings. Instead, she told him about her own life. She explained how her father had died when she was young, and how that loss had taught her to appreciate small moments with people she loved. She spoke passionately about her dream of opening a reading center for children who could not afford books. Daniel was fascinated by the way her eyes changed whenever she talked about helping others. She did not dream of becoming rich or famous. She simply wanted to create something useful for people who needed it. One afternoon, Daniel asked her why she spent so much time helping strangers when she had her own problems to deal with. Emma looked at him for a moment, before answering that sometimes people did not need money first. Sometimes they needed someone to remind them that they were still human. Her words stayed in Daniel's mind long after they separated that evening. He had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from him, yet Emma had never once asked for a favor, a gift, or even his real identity. She seemed interested in his thoughts rather than his possessions. Their conversations became longer, and soon they began meeting outside the subway station. They walked through quiet parks, visited inexpensive cafes, and sometimes sat on public benches talking until the sun disappeared behind the buildings. Daniel began noticing little things about Emma, such as how she always stopped to help elderly people with heavy bags, and how she remembered the names of children who visited her library. He also noticed that she could tell when he was pretending to be fine. One evening, while they were walking through the city, Emma suddenly stopped and looked at him seriously. She asked why he never seemed to make any real effort to change his situation. Daniel struggled to answer, because he knew that behind his poor appearance was a life of unimaginable wealth, and for the first time he began to wonder whether finding true love would require more than simply hiding his money from someone, because perhaps the person he was becoming around Emma was more important than the identity he had created to test her. Everything changed on a rainy afternoon when Daniel's carefully protected secret finally began to collapse. Until that moment, he had managed to keep his real identity hidden from Emma. But the longer their relationship continued, the more uncomfortable he became with the lie. His company was facing an important business problem, and his real assistant had been calling him repeatedly, asking him to return to the office immediately. Daniel kept delaying the decision because he did not want to abandon the life he had created with Emma. Even though he knew his responsibilities as the owner of a massive company could not be ignored forever. Then, while Daniel was sitting near the subway entrance, a photographer passing through the area suddenly recognized him. The photographer had seen Daniel Carter in business magazines and television interviews many times, and although Daniel was wearing old clothes and trying to look completely different, his face was impossible to forget. Within hours, photographs of Daniel sitting beside the subway entrance appeared online. The story spread quickly, and people were shocked that one of the richest businessmen in the country had been pretending to be homeless. Headlines described his strange experiment, and social media users began discussing why a billionaire would hide his identity in such a dramatic way. Emma eventually saw one of the photographs while working at the library. At first, she stared at the screen without understanding what she was seeing. Then she recognized the face immediately. The man she knew as David was actually Daniel Carter, the billionaire whose company she had heard about on the news. Her heart sank as she remembered every conversation they had shared. The next time Daniel arrived at the subway station, Emma was already waiting for him. She did not shout, and she did not create a scene. Her quiet expression made Daniel feel even more ashamed. She looked at him and asked why he had lied about his name. Daniel admitted that he had been afraid. He explained that he had spent years wondering whether people liked him for himself or for his money, and he believed that pretending to be homeless was the only way to discover the truth. Emma listened without interrupting, but her disappointment was obvious. She told him that she had treated him kindly because she believed every person deserved dignity, not because she wanted something from him. Daniel apologized and admitted that he had made a terrible mistake by turning her kindness into a test. He realized that while he had been searching for someone honest, he had been dishonest from the very beginning. Emma told him that the worst part was not discovering that he was wealthy, but discovering that he had not trusted her enough to tell her the truth. And as she stood there, looking at the man she thought she knew, she began to wonder whether anything between them had been real. Several days passed after Emma walked away from Daniel, and for the first time in years, the billionaire understood that money could not repair every mistake. He returned to his luxurious apartment, resumed his responsibilities at the company, and solved the business problems that had been waiting for him, but everything felt strangely empty. The expensive furniture, quiet rooms, private drivers, and endless opportunities no longer impressed him the way they once had. Daniel kept thinking about Emma and the simple kindness she had shown him before she knew his name or his wealth. He realized that she had never been interested in what he owned. She had been interested in whether he was hungry, cold, lonely, or simply needed someone to talk to. One afternoon, Daniel received a message from George, the older man he had met during his time near the subway. George told him to come to the community library because Emma was there. Daniel arrived nervous, unsure whether she had invited him because she wanted to forgive him or because she simply wanted to say goodbye. When he saw her standing among shelves of books, he slowly approached. Daniel told her that he did not expect forgiveness and admitted that he had betrayed the trust she had given him. He explained that his fear of being used had caused him to make a terrible decision. He had wanted to discover whether someone could love him without knowing his wealth, but instead of building trust, he had created a test that Emma never agreed to take. Emma listened quietly and told him that she was hurt, but she also understood that his fear had come from years of disappointment. Daniel then made a promise that he would never hide behind a false identity again. He told her his real name, his history, his struggles, and even the things he disliked about himself. For the first time, there was no billionaire image and no homeless disguise between them. There was simply a man standing in front of a woman and asking to be accepted for who he truly was. Emma eventually told Daniel that she had not forgotten the genuine moments they shared. She believed that although the situation had started with a lie, some of their conversations and feelings had been real. She also told him about her dream of opening a reading center for children from struggling families. Daniel offered to help, but he made it clear that he did not want to control her dream or take credit for it. He offered to provide the funding while allowing Emma to lead the project herself. Months later, the reading center opened its doors, filled with books, children, laughter, and hope. And as Emma watched the children explore the shelves, Daniel stood beside her, knowing that the greatest change in his life had not come from becoming richer, but from finally learning that love could only grow when two people were willing to face each other without masks.